Hi there, here we are again with another video in the beginning investigating Genesis. We are now looking closely at day 5. In Genesis so far what we have said is on day 1, in the beginning Elohim created the heavens and the void dark earth. He also separated light from darkness. On day 2 the big task was the separation of water from water in the sense of above from below. Long story, but you had it in day 2. Day 3, separation of dry ground and land and water, which was the seas. And he also created vegetation, which is based on photosynthesis and produced plants with fruit according to their kind for all future living things. So day 3 really sorted out the fact that almost all living beings later would be vegetarians. Day 4, creation of the sun and the moon to govern the day and the night respectively, to provide seasons also due to the earthly tilt of 23.5 degrees and the position in terms of the distance from the sun in its orbit, and almost like a secondary thought, he created the stars and the galaxies also. So day 5 is really all about creatures in the sea and creatures in the air. And if we look at day 5 a little bit closer, we see that there are some prehistoric flying beings with 9-meter wingspan, 250 kilograms, the prehistoric pterodactyl. There's also this enormous whale. The current biggest alive whale is about 30 meters long and weighs 190 tons. That's enormous. That really is an enormous creature. And if we look at something like this 12-meter long type of crocodile thing, 8 tons in weight, the Sarcosuchus prehistoric supercroc, you can see how large that was. And I have a picture here of a prehistoric Leviathan giant whale. So these are just some of the animals that were created on day 5. And when we look at the ones in the air, we see amazing creatures. We see something like the hummingbird on the right here. We see the various pictures there of the albatross below the hummingbird and the Arctic tern at the top there in the middle, and this Mongolian duck. It is so colorful, it is amazing. And these other two are just very weird looking, right? But they have their place in nature. But that's all part of this creation day. And in creation day, Genesis 1:20 to 21a says, "And God said, let the waters swarm with swarms." Those, by the way, are direct translations from Hebrew. Let the waters swarm with swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the heavens. And so God created the great sea creatures and every living creature that moves, with which the waters swarm, according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And here I also just got a couple of pictures. And you know, if we look at this eagle, fish eagle probably, catching that fish, the enormous detail as an aerodynamicist when I see these wings open and it's got everything there. It's got little winglets, it's got front edge flaps, it's got everything that you find on an aircraft too, except nature had it since day 5. And then on the bottom picture here you see all these tiny little animals there, like krill and plankton in general, and it is these big whales that feed almost entirely on these little creatures. And we see in verse 21b to 23 that God saw it was good. And God blessed them, and saying, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters in the seas, and let birds multiply on the earth. And there was evening and there was morning, a fifth day. And I've just put two pictures here of a flying creature like this bat at the top, which uses echolocation of insects, of obstacles while it is flying. And we also see the dolphins in the sea that are using echolocation as well. And each one has a totally, although the physics principle is the same, each one of these creatures has its own special way of dealing with the reflection of sound from objects to enable them to do this echolocation, to have that development of the echolocation process and mechanisms or whatever into such different kinds. God said, let the water swarm with swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the heavens. And so God created the great sea creatures and every living creature that moves, and with which the waters swarm according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. Now that sounds just like a beautiful sentence or two to just put it there. Well, they are the animals in the sea, they are the animals in the air, and that's it. But if you look at the Hebrew, there is so much hidden meaning in these texts. If we look at the English text swarm with swarm, in Hebrew that is really a single word that means an abundance, or implies an abundance in terms of plankton as well as fish. It was swarming with swarms of all these different kinds of fish. And living creatures in Hebrew means nepesh kaya, means living, and it has blood. In fact, the Hebrew is so much more deep that it can also mean soul. And nepesh kaya was also used in the creation of Adam and Eve. But any animal that has blood, like mammals, like birds, like fish, are living creatures in the sense of nepesh kaya. That is different for insects, by the way. They are not nepesh kaya. And birds are really not birds. The Hebrew word there is oph. I don't know if I pronounce these Hebrew words correctly, but oph, which includes ostrich, penguin, eagle, and it's much broader than birds because it includes every creature that flies. The great sea creatures is another one of these expressions, gadol and tanin, which really means sea monsters, whales. And the big white would be included in there too, and those would be different kinds. It also uses the word winged birds, and oph includes bats, and even the pterosaurs are included in that. And the word kinds, of course, means species as we use the word today. Kinds means anything that can interbreed. Now, the kinds and the species do not always go one-to-one. Why? Because human beings classified animals according to certain characteristics, didn't bother about the biblical kinds, or that was even a factor, and created the word species. So it turns out that there are many species of certain types of birds, which is not quite correct, because there are certain kinds of birds, that is correct. So some interesting facts here are that aquatic mammals like dolphins and whales are called cetaceans, and they are the same kind as I mentioned just now. And they can interbreed, and indeed they have done that already. Dolphins have sensitive echolocation ability and are amazingly intelligent. Anyway, whales also have an enormous lung capacity. Did you know that some type of whales can dive up to 2 kilometers down? And they have an endurance of 2 hours under the water without breathing? Remember, they are mammals. So, if we don't breathe for a couple of seconds, we're already in oxygen stress. But if it is minutes, we have a very limited amount of minutes, and then we are medically dead. So The whales also have something very interesting on the leading edges of their fins. They have turbulence generators there, which you sometimes see on aircraft as well, and it provides a better turning radius for making these bubble cages that whales make when they want to chase fish into a sort of a container made of bubbles. It's just an interesting little side issue. There are fish, crustaceans, starfish, mollusks, jellyfish, and fish that can live at great depth. Some of them even generating their own light at these deep, ultra deep areas where these fish live, 3 or 4 kilometers down in the ocean or deeper. And sometimes these fish can even live in chemical environments near smokers, who are these little miniature volcanoes, if you like, that are on the seabed, and there are sulfur compounds and all sorts of gases and superheated water coming out, superheated steam coming out of these smokers, as they are called. Now, we would think that it's poisonous, the water is too hot near them, and yet there is quite a lot of life at these smokers. Annual migration patterns that require enormous abilities and endurance and navigation, especially in birds. You know, if you think of some of the fish as well, they migrate vast distances, like the salmon and the whale and even sardines. And if you look just at the different kinds, and you see the differences between a seahorse and a squid or a manta, they indicate very complex systems, but they're entirely different. So to let one sort of descend from the other in an evolutionary sense is totally irrational to think. And it's not even reasonable to think so in scientific terms. But we'll get to that point a bit later. Important point is that these all reproduce in accordance with their kind, and these were present in the oceans and in the air since day 5. There's another interesting little example. Cans, I'm not sure if I pronounced that correctly, is a type of fish that's over a meter long, or quite a bit longer, I think. They were thought to have become extinct in the late Cretaceous, around 66 million years ago, but they were rediscovered in 1938 off the coast of South Africa, and they still look exactly the same. In fact, it looks very, very much as if that fish hasn't changed from 66 million years ago to today. And yet we are meant to believe that these extinct fossils, you know, they must have looked different. But we find that all over in the fossil record, that the kinds haven't really changed. What is also interesting is birds and bats and Pterosaurs are flying creatures with very highly specialized skills. Bats have echolocation, as I already mentioned, and they're extremely agile flyers, and it doesn't matter if it's day or night, they can still navigate in caves, in forests, and they don't hit anything. An avian lung has a flow-through system, while mammals have a sort of a bellows type breathing mechanism. Another interesting fact is, of course, feathers, and birds have feathers. Feathers are an incredible marvel of engineering for many, many reasons. And to evolve one type of lung or scales into feathers, or one type of lung into another type of avian lung, is almost impossible, either direction. Birds are definitely not evolved dinosaurs that you often see in museums and so on. There are pictures like that, but the feathered dinosaur does not exist. It never did exist. It's also interesting that birds were created before any land animals, which already excludes this notion of birds being descendants of dinosaurs. It's just not on. And each kind is a very complex system, if you can put it like that. The albatross, hummingbirds, the starlings, who in these big clouds have murmurations, You should have a look on YouTube on starling murmurations. It is really fascinating how that works. And the Arctic tern, this bird that lives in the Arctic and then annually flies down to the Antarctic, and then after the Antarctic summer flies back to the Arctic. It covers thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of kilometers to do this with uncanny accuracy in navigation. If you look at all these animals so far, the sea creatures as well as the flying creatures, you find that all exhibit very complex design, and that is rooted in the detail of their DNA. Superficially similar to the computer code maybe of Microsoft Windows, which required intelligence and very smart design to produce, by the way. But any op is actually much more complex. And those are things we must remember. The DNA carries the information of what this bird or this fish would be like. There are lots of cellular machines that are in the organism that look after energy production, which is really a chemical called ATP, adenosine triphosphate. It also enables all the chemicals in the body to be transported, to be stored, and there is a mechanism for retrieval, replication, proofreading, and error correction. The error correction, just roughly, is about 100 millionth. In other words, one part in 100 million, there could be an error. One part in 100 million, and it does that in a human being. I happen to know at cellular level something like 2,000 protein formations with uncoding the DNA and then building the proteins. It makes about 2,000 a second, and the error probability there is 1 in 10 to the 8. In other words, 1 in 100 million. And DNA isn't simply just a string packaged in its chromosomes. It is actually a 4D construction, only discovered in the last couple of years, and it's extremely complex. And the more complex a system is, the more the likelihood is that it has been designed. It has been designed that way, otherwise it could not work at all. Another point is the detailed DNA level requirements presuppose a vision of the final system. Information and knowledge and wisdom must be in place and a final system vision in that sense. It needs an intelligent designer. Nobody starts building a house without having a plan and without somebody having dreamt up this house in their head first. Cannot be done. You cannot say to 20 people, start building a house without any vision, without any idea of what this place is going to look like. I suppose artists can draw a picture like that, especially a modern picture. So evolution cannot inform knowledge, visualize a complex concept, and then proceed to come up with detailed design to fit that vision. It just can't. It is unreasonable and irrational to think that a random, non-intelligent material process, given even billions of years, would come up with a complex design as something like a hummingbird. It is just not possible. It would be irrational to think so, and I think it's not reasonable either. In the case of an op, a flying creature, it is also a very complex living being, and the design capability includes, at a minimum, very smart aerodynamics, very clever wing and body structure, navigation ability like you can't believe, the specific organs required for all this, including the avian lungs, details of metabolism, including respiration, reproduction, and the genetic detail for all these specialized cellular processes at cell level, such as building proteins, metabolize food, producing energy, etc. Now, this is far away from these 2 or 3 sentences in Genesis 1 that describes day 5. But remember, God had to do all that to say swarm with swarms and flying creatures opf that had to be there. Remember, all the physical parameters had to be there, but also at DNA and cellular level, there were amazing detailed design effort had to go in there to be able to come up with a bird. Be that the tern, be that the hummingbird, be that an eagle. God saw that what he had now done was good, and God blessed it. And God said, be fruitful and multiply and fill the waters in the sea and let birds multiply on the earth. And there was evening and there was morning, a fifth day. That God did this top down. And yet God can not only say, let us make the whale. God had to also sort out the hydrodynamics of a whale, the breathing, the construction, and the level of detail as complex as DNA, cellular metabolism, and all that sort of thing. My point here is that in creation, God had to create all those things simultaneously for all the kinds that we find in the air and in the water. Just think about that. And lest you say, yeah, but science has already described all that. That is true, because if we use the word description, that is quite true, because science describes what we see in nature, because in nature it is already there. Science does not explain how it came to be, although evolutionists would like to think so. Again, that's another story for another day. Romans 1:20, I just want to remind you again. I do it with every Genesis episode here. Romans 1:20 says, for since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse. Thank you very much for having a look, and think about it. As I've said before, maybe there are only two shows in town. Either you're created, or you're a random result of some random materialistic process, and there's no meaning, there's no morals, there's no God, there's just darkness. Think about that. Thank you.